Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I want to talk about our country's politics and governments, both the national government and our local governments. So I've asked Sabeel Rahman, a scholar of democratic theory and civic engagement, to be my guest. He's a fellow at the Four Freedoms Center at the Roosevelt Institute, who next year will become a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. I want to know what he thinks. Welcome.
Hi, Ronnie. Great to be here.
So we're a democracy. That means there is a fundamental foundation to what makes a democracy. Is it working right now?
I don't think it is, and I think most people would agree. If the core of our democracy is a government that's of, for, and by the people, on almost any measure, we're not really meeting that standard.
Where is it? What are we lacking?
So there's been a lot of research coming out recently that sort of confirms what I think a lot of people are concerned about, which is that by and large, public policy responds much more directly to the preferences and needs of the wealthier citizens. And then you couple that with the fact that sort of participation in elections and so on is not as high as it could be. The end result is government that's not as responsive and accountable to the people as a whole.
You talk about, I mean, this is almost like a cyclical thing, isn't it? We've had eras before where the super rich or the large corporations are motivating or directing the government. And then there's always been a populist movement of some kind that comes up in rebellion?
Yeah, so every generation faces its own unique challenges, but in a lot of respects, we've sort of been here before. And so some of my work looks back at a previous era. If you look back before the New Deal, but after the Civil War, there's this period of the first Gilded Age, and that was the period of the rise of the first mega corporations like Standard Oil. This is when J.P. Morgan was still a person, not a company, but kind of had a lot of wealth and influence. And it's around that time where a lot of reformers and activists started to get concerned about how economic inequality might be corroding their ideals of democracy. And that's when you start to see a lot of interesting new reform ideas, and they have a lot of resonance with, I think, the kinds of things that we're worried about today.
So today, the disparity between the very rich and either the middle class and even the very poor is greater than it's ever been, do you think? Or is that hard to relate?
I mean, it depends on what measure you use, but it's certainly increasing and has been increasing the last few decades. That's
and what I find interesting is that it's not the first time it happened. You know, you write about Justice Brandeis, and I took this quote because it's so fabulous. It says, "We can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both."
Yeah.
And that's it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's being facilitated, it seems to me, by the lack of activity from the electorate. I don't know if that's fair or not. I don't know if you really agree with that. But there isn't a rebellion. So we elect people who are now, with the new laws of campaign finance and the money that's spent, that obviously reflect those people, the wealth.
Elections absolutely matter. But I think in a lot of ways the problem is much broader than just elections. And so really, I would break it down into three or four things. So the first is what you mentioned, elections. And there's good data showing that actually, as you move up the income scale, you're more likely to participate in elections, in electoral politics. You're more likely to contribute to campaigns and so on. But then you've got a second problem, which is that by and large, most policymakers, especially if you look at the federal level, in Congress or in the executive, tend to themselves come from relatively upper social and economic classes, and that sort of directs policy in a certain way. And then the third piece is that political associations, whether they're unions or social movements or the kinds of bread and butter organizations that help ordinary people get involved and have political impact, those organizations have been declining. And so you add it all up and it produces this huge disparity in democratic accountability.
So what do we need to do?
We have our work cut out for us, but I think there's a lot of really exciting new approaches that people are experimenting with right now. So, I mean, the most famous of the debates is the campaign finance reform debate, and that absolutely has to be part of of the conversation.
And that not only cuts the power of the wealthy, but it also helps the people who don't have the money to begin with.
Right. So
New York City model is a very good one. Is there a better one in the country?
So there are a couple of states and localities that are experimenting with matching fund models, different ways of trying to, as you say, kind of balance the terms, encourage more people to get involved. So it's you can think of it as a leveling up of political participation. So there are a lot of important experiments in that regard. So that's one area where we need to do a lot of work, and a lot of people are putting a lot of thought into it. But I think we also need to think more broadly about what democracy means and the different places where we can try to inject more grassroots participation. So local level is a really important area where we have some kind of greater potential for people at the grassroots to participate in and help shape policy. I think there are ways that we could try to incorporate democratic participation even in the regulatory arena. So even after the bills are written, when regulatory agencies are writing the final rules and actually enforcing them, there's some opportunities there where we can have a more broad-based kind of participation.
But somebody has to bring that to the public's knowledge or view, right?
Yeah, right. So
how do we do that?
Yeah, so if you want to think about it in this way, we kind of have to bridge this gap between policymaking and ordinary people. And that requires action on both sides, right? So we need policymakers and our institutions to be more open, but we also need ways of bringing ordinary people to engage with the political process. So that means sort of across the spectrum, right? There's a lot of work being done now around open government and government transparency and different ways that we could reform government to make it more accessible. I think that's really important. Then, as I mentioned before, we need to rely on civil society organizations, political and social organizations that can help mobilize and encourage people to participate. And then we need to find ways to support ordinary people as well. I mean, it can be hard to be politically engaged when you're working 2 jobs and trying to put food on the table.
Have we ever had such really diverse, such opposite opinions about what government should do? I think there are a lot of movements now. Get rid of the government. It's not going to affect you. You know, take it out of my life.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's been one of the core tensions throughout our history, right? We have these 2 very different traditions of the role of government. One is the kind of limited government. We want to protect individual liberty from encroachment or arbitrary government power, but then there's also the idea of government as a supporter of freedom, as an agent of making us a more equal and a more just society. And these two views have been in tension going back for a long time. I think when we live in eras of high economic inequality like we are now, that tension is particularly sharp. But I wouldn't say it's new today. I mean, we've been having this battle.
So that's optimistic, and that the government will change eventually.
Yeah, I think it will. But I think part of why this conversation about participation and civic engagement is so important is that it really depends on what we, as a democratic society, can do to come together to transform how government works and to make it address our economic problems more directly.
Is the concept of consensus important in a democracy? You know, when I grew up, we talked about the common good. I was taught what it is to be a citizen. You vote, you do this, you worry about your neighbor, you do all these things. I don't hear that conversation very much anymore. Now, the common good itself implies that somehow everybody getting together has found some commonality, right? Does that lead us to consensus?
So consensus is hard, right? Because we're such a diverse country. And there are very real, legitimate disagreements about what the right thing to do is. So I would put it this way. I think a democracy requires us to all at least acknowledge the basic fact that we're all in this together. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to agree, but it does require that we have to be willing to engage in the process of figuring out what the right thing to do is, and to do that in good faith. But rather than consensus, the way I would put it is I think we need a system that can allow us to come to a decision, try out some ideas, and then if it doesn't work, or if we want to try something else, then go back and change the policy. But right now, certainly nationally, if you look, we're at more of a gridlock, and that's not really doing anybody any good.
But you suggest and support this idea of participatory democracy, participatory budgeting, for instance. So what does that mean? That means that everybody gets together to decide what the agenda is going to be and the order of importance of issues?
Yeah, so participatory budgeting is a really exciting new, well, not that new actually, approach, and it's just getting underway.
It's being used by some public officials.
What's interesting to me about it is that it kind of charts a middle path between the focus on consensus and acknowledging our disagreements. Because what participatory budgeting does is it creates a process that everybody buys into. They understand how to engage with it, and then they have a discussion at the very local level about what the priorities should be in their neighborhood, how much money to allocate to different types of projects, and it's not necessarily unanimous consent, but everybody's had a chance to be heard and has all agreed that on a process of how they're going to settle their disagreements, right? So at the end, there is a vote.
And you don't think that's consensus?
I mean, it's consensus of a kind, but I guess what I mean is consensus as opposed to unanimity.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
That's. I don't think that's the standard.
That's imposing something.
Right. I think the standard is having a fair process that everybody agrees, and then we follow the result of the process.
So part of the reason people don't vote is they think it doesn't make a difference. Why vote?
Yeah.
Part of the reason is they don't really understand the process, do they? I mean, I was looking at the primary results from the primary a couple of weeks ago. Now, we know that the state legislatures affect us some ways. And there were primaries. And in a lot of the districts, the winner of that primary is the person who's going to be elected. People got elected with 3,000 votes in districts of 150,000. So how do we get them to do that? You feel they should feel that it makes a difference, but how do you make them feel that?
Right. So it's a good question. I mean, I think that for participation to be meaningful, there has to be a sense that it's actually going to change something, right? And that's setting aside the more bread and butter issues of, it can be really hard to register. It can be, it's really hard to vote if you have to wait in line for hours and hours and you have to work and election day isn't a holiday. So there are all sorts of other additional barriers. But fundamentally, I think it's about restoring a sense of efficacy, of faith in the process. And that's a much deeper problem. I think people are pretty smart, right? They have a sense that things don't change in the direction that we want it to, despite the elections that we have, and that's a much deeper problem.
Are we missing the common good energy? In recent years, you look at the country is basically a two-party system, right? And those parties are now all over the place. I mean, the Democratic Party has got some people who would have been moderate Republicans.
Yeah.
And the moderate Republicans, the Republican Party has moved to the right.
Yeah.
And as these parties have become more diversified, it seems to me, and as more money comes in, the money is especially important, people aren't running on a party's platform. I mean, our parties, contrary to like in England, I guess, with the Labour and the Conservative Party, there's a difference. But we don't see that difference now, and we don't have that feeling. So the people who've managed to make change are the people like the women's lobby for the women's pressure to equal pay, the gay and lesbian community for gay marriage equality. All these different things become special interest projects.
Right. Wouldn't
it be better if we were able to bring them all together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, but I also think that parties are fundamentally reactive institutions rather than leading institutions, and by that what I mean.
They haven't always been, though, have they?
I mean, it's varied over time, but I think the real driver, if you look at sort of our moments of great social and democratic progress, right? The real drivers have been civil society, social movements, people getting organized and putting pressure in the way that you gave the example.
Well, then you had the unions, right?
Right. So I think we want to. So if we step back from parties and we ask, where's the pressure coming from? Where are people getting organized to actually put that pressure? And then we start to see that the core source of the problem is that it's actually we've lost a lot of those types of organizations. Now we've also gained a lot. I mean, I don't want this to be a purely sort of declinist story. I mean, there's a lot of really exciting organizing work that's happening. Whether it's organizations like the National Domestic Workers Alliance or
the National what?
Domestic Workers Alliance and groups like that, National People's
Center for
Action.
What's it called? The Center for Response. I don't.
Well, so
progressive something.
Right. So
yeah.
there are a bunch of groups that are trying new ways, using new technologies, and trying to organize groups that have historically not had political impact, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to help drive.
And then we always need that dramatic thing to happen so that it gets us off.
Yeah.
Like Ferguson.
Yeah.
Which we're now beginning to see, tying it in to the restrictions that have been put on voting.
Right.
It's all coming together there.
Right. I mean, it really had an impact as focusing the discussion. And so to go back to your point about inequality, a lot of people criticize the Occupy Wall Street moment for not having concrete demands. But if you look, they really did change the conversation. I mean, even if you count how often newspapers and the media mention the word inequality, the line, the sharp
and the
switchover
99%.
was, and that whole lingo came out of that moment. And, it's because those types of big events do focus our attention, do have a narrative power, but then it's sort of on the rest of us to pick up that opportunity and try to move the conversation
I was very
forward.
disturbed by the pressure to get Occupy to have specific goals, because I thought that's when they broke up, when they started separating out into different issues. I thought that the main thrust was the most powerful.
Well, and it still had quite a big ripple effect. Yeah. So I'll give one example. One of the core issues that came up during Occupy was the question of too big to fail, and why didn't we have more accountability for financial organizations? And there was a group that came out of Occupy called Occupy the SEC, which then went and did a lot of research and submitted a 300-page kind of comment letter to the SEC detailing their proposals for the Volcker Rule, which was one of these provisions in the Dodd-Frank bill that passed. And so very concrete, and that kind of policy debate is still underway. So there were actually quite a few things like that came out of that moment, even concretely.
What do you think of this lawsuit that is it Greenberg who's bringing against AI?
Right.
What's his name?
Against AIG.
Yeah, AIG, but is it Ace Greenberg? I don't know.
Yeah,
anyway,
right. So I haven't looked closely at the case. I mean, I do think that we need some sort of evaluation of all of what's happened in the last few years.
It seems to me it's an opportunity to bring the issue back up.
Right. And I mean, it's hard because there are all these trade-offs involved there's a kind of immediate crisis situation, and then in a longer-term question of how do you restore stability to the system, prevent those kinds of crashes from happening.
So now we're faced with midterm elections. Everybody says midterm elections has the lowest vote turnout of always, historically. I keep hoping they're wrong this time. But what happened to the country basically came from midterm elections. One of the things with the reapportionment that was where all these people were able to be elected so they could affect their own state's
Right.
delegation, right?
Right.
How do we make that important? I mean, we just need it, huh?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is important. It's
Yeah.
always been important. There are sort of structural reasons why midterms are hard to get the level of engagement that you have in presidential elections. So that
We're going to have to wait.
we're going to have to wait and see. I mean, I don't think the turnout is going to be that different this time around than
was.
most midterms, and it will have real impacts. But that's why, to my mind, sort of we have to take a longer term view, right? That
We better.
our democracy has sort of been ailing for a long time, and it's not just a cycle to cycle issue. And I think where we can have the most impact in the long run is in trying to build that foundation so that people can have real political voice in the long run. So building up those organizations that can help empower and mobilize constituencies and creating more opportunities for
Let's
engagement.
talk a little bit about you. How did you get interested in all of this?
I've always kind of been interested in this work. I was born in New York, but grew up sort of all over. My father worked for the United Nations, and so I kind of from an early age was interested in issues of democracy and inequality. And then, when coming out of high school and going to college, sort of decided that this was a set of issues that I really wanted to focus in on.
So you not only went to college, you then went to law school? Or did you get a master's degree first?
I went to Oxford and got a master's in economics, and then I came back to do a JD and a PhD.
So you have a PhD and you're a lawyer, an
Yes,
attorney.
Yeah, right.
And nothing dampened your enthusiasm.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot. I mean, these are big questions, right? And there's a lot to think about. But I also think there's a lot to do. And part of my trajectory was trying to find that sweet spot between the sort of historical and big ideas about what democracy means, what those core values are, and then the really concrete of how do we make that real. And that's where something like law or economics, these types of disciplines can be really helpful in translating our values into reality. But you can't just look at the tools by themselves, right? You need to know what we're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And you need to get involved in the politics of it.
Yeah, right.
I've always been, astonished at the gap between academics and practitioners.
It's a huge
Sometimes
gap.
you make the academics, I'm sorry, but some of them look silly.
Well, it's a
don't mean
huge
to-
gap. No, I mean it's a really big problem, right? It's a huge gap, and it should be said, some scholars are really good about this, of trying to
Oh, definitely.
kind of bridge that divide.
You're going to
but-
be an activist scholar.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. But sort of structurally, I think it's a challenge for academia to find ways to stay engaged as a whole. Definitely, there are individuals who do a great job. But here too, I think we're sort of at the start of a really exciting sort of renaissance. I mean, you have a lot of social scientists now are getting much more directly engaged in areas like political reporting, timely research that can help clarify a lot of these types of issues, like where's the inequality coming from, what are the differences in participation rates, some of these things we've been talking about. There are a lot of scholars working on this that are really helping drive the conversation. And even on areas like campaign finance, there are a lot of people working on sort of different ways, models, ideas of how we can address that problem. So people are aware of the need to build a bridge. I think we need to do more of it. But
We have, I'm thinking about it. We have the Brennan
yep.
Center.
Brennan Center, yeah.
It's doing a lot of work,
They do great work, yeah.
on election and
Yep.
that kind of stuff. We have, the Roosevelt Institute's college campus.
Yeah, they
is
do.
great, right?
They do a lot of great
They're
work.
all
as
over the
well.
country?
Yeah, all over, kind of chapters in colleges and community colleges all over the country. Yeah.
And the Institute supports people like you.
Yeah, it's there are lots of other think tanks and organizations that help fill that gap, and then there are movements among academics themselves. And so there's a organization called the Tobin Project that helps work with academics to do policy-relevant research from the get-go.
It's at Harvard?
It's based in Cambridge, but they work nationally, and then there's another organization called the Scholar Strategy Network, which tries to sort of connect up recent social science research to kind of the major policy issues of the day, whether it's on inequality or
And then there's this organization that's grown so fast, the Center for Progressive Democracy, which is connecting a lot of the local activist communities together.
Yeah, they're a really interesting organization as well.
It's just blossomed.
Yeah, right. And I think these organizations, they're sort of emblematic of the hunger that is out there for a new way to connect up ideas and activism to try and really make headway on issues of economic inequality, of our ailing democracy. And so that we have all the pieces, right? There are plenty of people who are really putting a lot of energy into this.
But we need to produce more representatives of our feelings. Is that what we say?
That's one of the challenges. And so there's an interesting new study, or newish study, about how the members of Congress there are fewer and fewer members of Congress who actually come from working class backgrounds, and as a result, they just have a different worldview about economic policy, even if they're operating in good faith and wanting to do the right thing.
And not with their campaign contributions.
Yeah, right. So even setting that stuff aside, and so our system was built to be a representative system, and there are major ways in which our policymakers are not really representative on the whole.
Well, we've come to the end of this program, so thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And I hope you'll come back after you've taught 1 year of constitutional law.
I would love to keep the conversation going.
And hear more of your progress. Thank you.
That sounds great. Thanks
you,
Ronnie.
Very much. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.